Hi, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. Many of us parents are constantly asking ourselves how the last few years have impacted the social emotional development of our children. And so tonight I am joined by some of our wonderful faculty members who are going to share with us more about social emotional development. So they'll share more about the importance of social emotional learning, the emphasis Bennett places on this, what they've noticed in students across the developmental ages due to the pandemic, and how our students are being supported. And I will moderate this evening by providing our faculty members with some prompts around social emotional learning. And as we go through, I'd actually like to ask each of you on the panel with me to introduce yourselves to our audience that we cannot see who's behind the scenes, and what grade levels you support before you respond the first time. And our parents and guardians, feel free to put questions into the chat as we go, and I'll try to interweave them throughout this evening. So with that, I would love to have Yvonne, if you could kick us off by really just sharing what social emotional learning is.
Sure. So my name is Yvonne Villacorte. I am the school counselor and I oversee and support PK through fourth grade. So essentially, social emotional learning is a framework. Each age range, if you will learn and acquire different skills that will build on each other and increase in complexity. So each stage has its own developmental challenge, if you will. We always think of the classical terrible twos, right? That comes with its own set of challenges, adolescence. And so everything in between has its own set of obstacles. I really want to be able to emphasize that these are life skills, right? And by centralizing the social emotional learning in the educational setting, I think we give students an opportunity to learn how to navigate the world in a way that's productive and healthy and autonomous. Similar to the way that our kiddos learned how to walk, right? They sometimes fall, but we dust them up, get them ready, and keep giving them the opportunity to learn and practice. So that's kind of social emotional learning in a nutshell.
Thank you. I think to dig a little deeper, let's take a look at maybe the five, what we could say overall kind of key skill areas are in social emotional learning: self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision-making, and how we support student development in these key areas. So let's start with self-management. And Charlotte, would you mind sharing with us about self-management, or really the ability to manage one's own emotions and thoughts and behaviors effectively in different situations? Can you share how you prioritize that development of self-management skills in the classroom?
Yes. Good evening, everyone. I'm Charlotte McRoberts. I teach in SK with Miss Malazzo and Mr. Geiger and Miss Brockman. So this year, especially we're still in the midst of the pandemic, but a lot of what we see in the classroom in terms of what we expect our kiddos to be able to do at this stage in SK is identifying and labeling their emotions. So the work that we've been doing throughout the school year in order to allow them to be confident to do this is we start with random check-ins. So in the morning, throughout the day, and at the end of the day. And these check-ins are done just to see how they're doing emotionally. And it's important that we do these check-ins when they're experiencing positive emotions, not just negative emotions. So they learn the purpose, like there's purpose and intent behind communicating all of your emotions, not just when something is wrong, but when you're doing okay as well. So the way we facilitate this is having social circles where we read stories in small groups, or we have one-on-one conferences with a student and a teacher where we can ask them questions like, what do you notice? If there's a situation happening, what are you feeling? Is it in your heart? Is it in your mind? Is it in your body that you're feeling something? And here's what I noticed. And then we can come together and come up with a plan to problem solve and use some of the language that we've been talking about a lot throughout the year to first acknowledge their experiences. We want to validate you are experiencing experiencing some emotions right now, we try to stay away from the language of, is this a big deal or is this a small deal? Because clearly they're having some experience, so it's a big deal to them. So honoring those emotions, but also having conversations and giving them the language to be able to process. So first, coping strategies, maybe taking deep breaths or counting or finding spaces that are safe for them to have some alone time in the classroom. And then coming back together to have a conversation about it to see what kind of plan can we come up with, which also incorporates their organizational skills. So being able to problem solve, think of strategies, but also see through with the plan using a lot of if then statements, or first we do this, then we do that. And then giving them the autonomy to choose within that statement as well, so they feel like they're a part of the planning that we are making. Also, having them advocate for their needs. What is their body telling them they need? Sometimes they need a little bit of rest, their quiet time. They fall asleep, they're cranky, they're coming back from break, they just had a full lunch, so they may need a little bit of time. So instead of acknowledging it in a way of like, oh, you're tired, maybe you should get some more rest before you come to school. It's like, okay, if your body is telling you that you need rest, you need rest. So teaching them to honor what they feel, that also plays a part in the way that they'll communicate with what their needs are, but also how they communicate with their peers and the problem solving, and how they can communicate with their teachers and advocate for themselves. And all of those tools are meant to be foundational skills that are laid. So at each developmental stage, we're just building on, not really reteaching the skill or the communication, but adding more rich language that is developmentally appropriate as they continue to grow. So yeah, how we do this in class, we can facilitate these kind of conversations in a small group. Or we may lean on our school counselor to come in and do a small group, maybe do a read aloud. We also do a lot of modeling and role playing to introduce concepts and topics to them, but also give them the space to hold them accountable to like, okay, now you show me that you understand what we're talking about, or this skill or this emotion. Show me you understand with your actions. So for example, if we're in the middle of a transition and someone is having a little bit of a time transitioning, stopping to acknowledge, like, I see that you're trying, I see that you want to be a part of our line, but can you remind me what it looks like to be an SK or walking in the hallway? So for one, that's acknowledging like there's something that we need to work on. Two, giving them the autonomy to speak like, yes, I do know what you're talking about. And then three, allowing them to show. And that could be applied with transitions or social emotional needs and conversations, bringing them into the conversation more and listening so they feel like they're a part of their growth and development as they continue to navigate complex emotions right now at the times that we're living in school and learning their peers.
I like how you mentioned too, kind of building upon these foundations. So not just speaking from SK students specifically, but that the skill doesn't change. They're building upon these foundations. It's even your example of identifying their emotions and having conversations and unpacking conversations. And as that builds over time, students are using color wheels. They're using rating scales to self-identify. So that isn't changing where we're identifying our emotions, but how that approach is done and where that independence kind of shifts throughout maybe more of the adolescence. So thank you. And then what about, let's move to responsible decision making. And really that ability to make caring and constructive choices about personal behavior and social interactions across different situations. So Caitlin, can you share with us how you support the students in this?
Hi, everyone. Yes, I'm Caitlin. I'm part of the SK team, and a lot of the work Charlotte has already beautifully displayed and articulated. You'll see that the topics that we're going to talk about, they all kind of interconnect into one big web together. So self-management is really going to have a lot to do with responsible decision-making. And as children mature, they are given increased opportunities to demonstrate their ability to choose. So, especially in kindergartners, when they're developing that sense of themselves and relationships to others in the way that informs their choice making. So, through cause and effect, children are organically learning how to make better choices and to take appropriate risks through understanding how their actions are affecting others. And is that the reaction I was hoping for, or is there something that happened that was misunderstood? So, this organically happens through cause and effect, but in the classroom, how we kind of help facilitate and to support some of those decision making is offering choices. That is number one. One of the things that we do as educators, because it is crucial as children learn to become an advocate for themselves, that they need to feel heard. And so having choice and being part of that process really is able to know that there's a partnership within that control and that there's a balance there. So you're able to meet with them on their level first, and then you're able to kind of redirect and help make a plan on what it is that their goal is they're trying to meet within the action or the decision that they're going forward with. For example, if a child, say it's literacy time, if a child, is maybe feeling like they're missing home, or maybe, this space isn't working for them, maybe we'll go up to the child and be like giving them a choice. So I notice like, should we move to a different space? Or what space in the classroom do you feel that you feel is going to work best for you? So giving them the opportunity to advocate for themselves what they need in the moment, but also recognizing like how we're trying to be there along the way to support them and give them that nudge, like, this isn't working here, but how about you tell me where it might work better? Another opportunity too, where we think about decision making and choices, is always giving choices within boundaries. So say sometimes, there's going to be children that are going to test to see what they can get away with. And this is a natural part of development. And so making sure that there's choices that are offered that they can choose from, but also within reason, that they're able to still follow through with completing that task and being accountable for it. So say it is math time, and this is a time where they are really, really just excited to play with the dice, and maybe it's not the intent of what the math activity is. We'll let them know, like, if this is what you want to do at this time, okay, that's fine. But just so you know, during explorations or another part of our day, let's pick it out a time that's going to work best for you, for us to get this work done. Because if you're choosing to do this now, we can choose to do this activity how we were meant to have it planned later. And so that's going to allow them to be like, maybe I should stick with this activity right now so I can get to the next thing later. Or if this is a true need, they're able to advocate for themselves and feeling like, yeah, I think I just need to take some time to work on what I want to do first before I can get to what everybody else is doing in the group. And that's okay, because that's honoring really what that individual is needing in the moment. And it's beautiful to see them be part of that decision making. And it's going to influence their decisions for further activities and other parts of their day. Another opportunity to kind of help reinforce the decisions that children are making throughout their day is using positive reinforcement and praise. A lot of that, praise, can go such a long way, especially for teachers wanting children to have that excitement, and we're looking for that desired behavior. For example, sitting at the rug at morning meeting time. We're hoping that all of our friends are listening to the messages, are taking part of that turn taking, but there might be some times or some moments where they might want to play with something in their hands. So I think for our teachers, what we'll do in order to help with those decisions, to make sure that they're also part of the conversations, is praising the desired behavior of the students that are happening in the circle time. So saying, oh, I love how so-and-so is looking at the speaker when they're sharing their message. I thank you so much for so-and-so for making strong eye contact. It's never just saying thank you, but you're just making sure that you're labeling the behaviors and the actions that you're hoping for all of your friends to be engaging in, and not just calling out the actions of someone that might be having that wiggly body, because then they know that they're getting the attention for the wiggly body instead of for that desired behavior. So making sure that you're honoring and pinpointing the behaviors that you want and really praising those, so that there could be more follow through of that behavior that you're seeking and hoping for as a teacher, so that there's a better flow and that learning environment is beneficial for all. We love to use different types of behavioral management tools. We have a love jar. These are really to celebrate those moments where we see these love moments, and also to encourage them, because they're going out of their way to help someone and be part of, stepping out of their own comfort and being like, oh, going up to a friend, do you need help with tying your shoe? Do you need help with this? And that can go a long way. So kind of celebrating that so they can do more of that behavior, and making it a classroom activity. So our love jar would be for the class. We want to honor those love moments that we catch, and we'll have children put in a pom-pom into this clear jar, and then together as a team or a group, they'll work together to fill that jar up. Along the way, since it is transparent, they can see how much they've accomplished, which is really nice to inform those decisions. And then at the end, once the jar is filled collectively as a group, we can come together to figure out what it is that we want to do to celebrate all of those love moments as a team. So different sort of behavioral tools are helpful. Mantras are really helpful. So calm bodies make calm choices. And just reminding friends too, that it's okay to make mistakes, and that having those problem solving conferences that Ms. McRoberts has already talked about what did you learn, and having that time to reflect, that's going to help inform those decision-making steps along the way as well.
Thank you, Caitlin. I also liked at the end how you mentioned kind of also weaving in a mistakes-friendly environment is so important and critical in the classrooms too. So let's shift to maybe supporting relationships. And when we're thinking of classrooms, relationships with peers, how do we prioritize kind of students' ability to build and maintain healthy and supportive relationships? And then really how to navigate these settings with different individuals or groups. So Shay, would you like to speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I'm Shay Fee. I teach second grade. It's my sweet spot. I think relationships is it's interwoven in everything that we do. I think, part of it is creating that environment from the start. We do those things where we're having open houses or intake conferences, school wide, to get to know each student individually. And so they're not seeing us on the first day of school for the first time. And I think that that's setting the precedent of that, our relationship and, team building with parents, obviously, as well. But we do all of those relationship buildings, and a lot of them mainly occur in my classroom, at least, is in morning meetings. The beginning of the year, you do a lot of those icebreakers and, find someone who, or a game where it's me too, and you have to, I have a dog, me too, and those types of things where kids are finding connections maybe they wouldn't necessarily find with other students. And that also goes along with, when you're creating this space, the environment that you're creating, a lot of the times you'll see some blank walls, or I remember students coming in and seeing, these little pockets, and that's where the job sticks goes with the kids' names of what responsibilities are you going to have in the classroom. And I never set those up and have the job set for them. We have to work together as a community within our class to develop what do we all need. Do we need a door holder? Do we need a pencil sharpener? Things like that. And that starts to help build that sense of community and those relationships. Back to what I was saying about morning meeting, one of my favorite things is every year I do growth mindset challenges. And again, that kind of brings in what Caitlin was saying with the piece of making mistakes is okay. And they're learning, we did this tangram challenge once where they had to put all these shapes together to make a square, and it was really hard. And it was probably a 3-day process until they got it, and they wanted to give up, and they were using the strategies, try new things, whatever. But during all of this, they're encouraging each other and learning that they're not the only one that struggles. A lot of the time, it's very normal for students at this age at the primary age at least, is like that egocentric, like I'm the only one. And I think a lot of the things that we do at Bennett with these open conversations and, you know, team building activities allow students to not feel so isolated and build off of those, maybe those challenges. We do, like Charlotte said this earlier, we also do a lot of role playing of like, how do we handle these peer conflicts, how, like, not directly going to a teacher. And these kids are starting to really, you know, develop these individual skills where, you know, it's okay that you're frustrated with your best friend and you can take a break, and that's okay. And so learning that, you know, I every year at the beginning of the year, I always say to my kids, I'm like, you're going to get frustrated with me, you're going to get annoyed with me. I was like, but at the end of the day, you have to know that in our relationship, I'm doing it because I care and I love you and I want you to do better. And I think that once they learn that, those relationships, you know, that goes with peer to peer, that goes with, you know, teacher to student, all of the above. And then another thing I just wanted to mention is we do so much small group work, literacy, math. We have writing buddies. And like, for example, with writing buddies is one of my favorite because they set goals at the beginning of the year and they're put with somebody that they wouldn't necessarily pick. And they really support and watch each other grow and will do strategies and provide constructive criticism and kind of learn that level of communication. And then one of the other things I love that we do at Bennett is that cross grade level activities, like when we're doing project work, we do, like, you know, we do sometimes buddy reading with the younger and the lower students. And this is a great way for the older students to take on that leadership role. And the younger students are excited to, you know, maybe they have a brother or sister or something, like they get to really embrace those roles and not just stick to one role, like in one class. And I think that also goes with the relationship building amongst specialist teachers too. These kids are, you know, not only you know, they're not with us, just us, they're building these relationships with teachers, other teachers as well. You know, and I wanted to say one more thing about, like, we talked a lot about, you know, the pandemic and how that was a huge, you know, struggle in terms of relationships. And I think, you know, all of these things that I'm talking about, like morning meeting or project work, as challenging as it was to do online, it was a really great challenge because the students actually had, like, I would give them opportunities when we would do literacy groups. We would still meet in small groups and breakout rooms. And I would give them like the first 5 minutes just to catch up and chat, you know, providing those opportunities any way we can because people need people. And, you know, again, I think also with that, we did, Yvonne, you came in a couple times with the remote learning and what are their needs. And I think that's another thing is our role as teachers is whatever kids are struggling with in terms of relationships, it's our job to recognize that and be like, hey, this is something, you know what, how can I create an activity during morning meeting or a discussion or a book that can help build these, you know, peer relationships? And I could go on and on. So
thank you. Well, I'll come back to you for the next one. How about, let's look at supporting the development of social awareness and unpack that a little bit, or the ability to really understand the perspectives and empathize with others. So Caitlin, could you share a little bit with us on social awareness?
Yeah, I would love to. For social awareness, it is such like a big concept, especially as children now are adjusting to these larger classroom environments. They're used to, like, especially after the pandemic, you have the confinement of being in your home, you have limited noise, but then when you come into this classroom, there's like all this excitement, there's more sharing, there's more people, which means that there's more conflict. And in that, we have to also recognize the needs of not just oneself, but the needs of others too. And how do we become aware about that? So a lot of the conversations really stem from having social circles, which we've talked about a lot and emphasized a lot, but really these small intimate group discussions are really important because we're filling kids' toolbox with strategies on how to navigate the uncomfortable and also sometimes the new, because they have not had all of these experiences to make a plan or to compromise, because it really depends on what was happening in your household and the people that you surround yourself during those times. And so that social awareness right now really has to be focused on heightening it up, but also breaking it down. So we're with each other in this large group setting for many parts of the day, but in order for us to learn and take in these toolbox, we have to do it in more intimate settings. So having social circles and small group circles, or even times where you can step out of the classroom with a group of friends and have a conversation, is going to be important so that we can apply the things that we're learning about in a more intentional way. So in a social circle, what those really consist of is recognizing the need in your classroom environment. So what are some things as a teacher that you're recognizing that is happening where our friends are moving too fast? And what can we do as teachers to slow it down? And what we call that is adding friction. So when we add friction into the dynamics, we're trying to have our friends slow down and work at a pace that is going to work for them, but also for them to consider others and others that are in their space as well. For example, one of the things that we've included in our social circles, we've been talking a lot about just patience, delayed gratification. What does that look like? When I'm having a conversation with somebody, we have to literally wait, because if we jump in, that might hurt their feelings if we step on their words. And so making this in a more fun way where it's going to land, because just talking about it, you have to like engage them and have these like enthusiasm. So social stories work great where you can have characters. So we're not really applying like students' names by any means, because we want to make sure that we're honoring that privacy. And so whenever we're using examples that we're recognizing in the classroom, it's always either the characters in the book or either like pretend animals, because in that way, children are more open to speak about their feelings, because it's easier to speak to an item than it is speaking about yourself. And that's the first step to really opening up that layer of social awareness. So for these concepts, it might look like interrupting could be a social concept that we'll talk about in our social circle. Maybe it might be sharing. It might be something that's even bigger than that, which could look like good and bad. Those were a lot of labels that were being used. So having a conversation about, good and bad, these labels are actually unhelpful. When you say that you're a good friend, I'm going to be like, wait a minute, what did I do so good? Why are they saying that to me? So we have to really unpack that and break that down. So we want them to recognize that, to take away those labels or those words, but actually describe it through your actions. I love things like, I love your drawing because you added so many details, and I've never seen someone make a unicorn that way before. Can you teach me? Things that are going to have actual understanding of what they're doing and their behavior, so that they can feel good about themselves, but also learn from one another in a way where we are having that beautiful exchange of perspectives. Something that we've included in our classroom, just based on the social circles that we're doing, and I know each classroom, we're really good about that at Bennett, is we make something that's going to best help our students by having a tool that either relates to the literacy or math that we're working on. So for SK, we're in a measurement unit, and we've been talking a lot about consideration. So this is our little consideration scale. On one side, you'll notice that there is sandpaper, and those are maybe some of the feelings, and that the sandpaper side is maybe we have to think a little bit more of how we can be more considerate for others in these moments that we're recognizing. And the pom-pom side are those words or those actions that build us up, that make us feel cozy and good inside. These might be a little bit too rough, but it's great because it's a learning moment. So it's natural. We're going to learn from these. So in our consideration scale, it's really nice because our friends now are able to see the physical, how words we use with one another and our actions influence how we feel. And the consideration scale brings to life the physical weight behind our words and actions. So by seeing this, they're able to really understand, we can do better. And what does do better mean? And have those conversations. And at the end of the day, be able to unpack our scale and really see let's do a little bit comparative math. How many more learning moments can we have? And what can we do and set some new goals for us tomorrow? And so it's a fun way to bring in those academics, but really honor like that this is real life and we're going to have sandpaper moments, and how do we learn from them? Also, let's be a little bit more intentional about the words that we use and show through our actions how we can be a friend to one another. And I think through these different tangibles, it's really going to help our children and even ourselves slow down and do things in a more careful and meaningful way, because we really do want to make sure that we have friends feel seen, heard, and loved. So these are just a few things that we bring to light about the social awareness in our school and for others. And it's not only in our classroom, but how do we expand that outside of our community too?
Thank you. I was smiling when you shared about the consideration scale, because I visited your classroom a few times and was watching pom-poms being added and didn't quite knew the response and why pom-poms were being added, but I didn't know about kind of the larger context. So thank you for sharing that. So let's take a look at the last kind of key skill area in social emotional learning before we hear a little bit from our panel here of what they see in our students of some of the impacts of the pandemic. So looking at the last kind of key skill of self-awareness, or that ability to understand one's own emotions, thoughts, and values, and how they influence behavior across contexts. Shay, can you share with us about how you support this development in the classroom or at school?
Yeah, I think too, again, it starts with the teachers as far as us being self-aware. And again, it goes back to that mistake piece of like, my students know all of my weaknesses, and that's something like that I'm aware of or that I'm working on. So like, for example, my partner struggles with organization, I struggle with technology. They know this, and they know that I'm trying to work on that. So showing that vulnerability is like where I usually start with students of like, I am a human, I'm working on stuff, and I'm being self-aware of it. It might not always be easy, but this is where it starts. And I think that that really hits home to kids, because students don't necessarily at first see you as this real person who has these struggles. And so I think that that has really impacted a lot of students, especially during the pandemic when we all had to show this is hard. We do that, like we said, like a lot of the reflection questions, like in morning meeting, or Caitlin, I like how you called it the social circle, but in morning meeting, we do a lot of reflection questions or check-in questions. And like, for example, in the beginning of the year, one of the questions was, what's something you want your teacher to know about you? So things like that, where students are really, pushed and challenged to dig a little bit deeper and really think like, what do I want my teacher to know about me? Or at the end of each day during closing circle, we usually ask a question that has to do with a reflection of like, we do the peaks and the valley, or like the highs and the lows of the day, or how could I do better tomorrow if it was a challenging day. So all of these things really help support students in better understanding and recognizing themselves, but also themselves within a community. I think one of the things that Allie Marsh and I did the last couple of years, which has been super helpful, is like we do reflection sheets at the end of each trimester, where kids are really, they sit and they have to take their time, and it's not about what we think. It's like, what was your favorite subject this year? What was the hardest thing you learned this year? Like, what was it? How did you feel about this trimester and what you learned? Because I'm not going to go to a family and share this information based on my perception. Like, we want to hear it from them. And those types of things where they're kind of also taking ownership of like, oh yeah, I'm my own person. I have my own feelings, my own thoughts, my own interests, things like that. And it's been really helpful. We also did which was super interesting, and I recommend it to every teacher. We did a morals and values survey. And so we did, like, my partner and I did the example of ourselves and what we thought was the most important in our lives. And we showed that it was different and that this was for them, so not like to please, getting, really good grades. If we did grades, like doing really well in school is the most important thing. We would say, this is for you. And it was really eye-opening to them, and then they had to explain the why behind it. So these types of activities really challenge them, that and probe them to think about things that they wouldn't necessarily think about. And I think that that's helped them grow individually in their self-awareness of, we know people have certain things in a class, we create, I call it our second family, and they might say, oh, so-and-so, we know they're a great artist, but we also want to make sure that within these, students becoming more self-aware, that doesn't mean that's their only role or that's the one thing about them. Another thing we did, and I did this with Charlay last year, and she led this project. So again, we use a lot of that self-awareness piece comes through checking questions, closing questions, open discussions, books, all of those things. But one of the things we did last year that Charlay led, which was an identity project with the second graders, and it was awesome because it was a really good opportunity where they had to create a visual, like Caitlin said, a visual representation of what they value and what they, what's the most important things in their life, or how would they describe themselves. And then they had to pick a number of objects to signify those different pieces of their life. Like, even if it was one student had like fashion, and it was some like cloth, and it was a pattern that she really liked. And so there were these different pieces, and it made them also go home and ask themselves and their families, what are your morals and what are your values? And we also talked about sometimes they might be different, and that's okay. And so that self-awareness piece is like, this is the first time in their life where, they're a part of a different community, and they're learning who they are within that community through that type of work. And then I just wanted to add the piece about the pandemic with all of this stuff that was happening and them going remote. One of the coolest things, and I always tell parents, because we always say, we're playing catch up for what was lost during that time. And one of the things I like to reiterate, and this is huge with self-awareness, is this was a really great opportunity for students to reflect on like how they work, what their self-discipline looks like. They had to be flexible. They had to develop their executive functioning skills. And students learned, okay, am I the type of student, like, what's my workspace look like? What helps me the best to focus? Do I need music on in the background, or do I need a complete quiet? And those things really helped probe their thinking of like, okay, what is it that I need? And develop that awareness, because they had to be self-disciplined within those situations. So even though it was tough, it was a good challenge for some of these kids, especially like at the age level that I'm teaching, where they had to develop that independence and learn a little bit about themselves in these challenging situations. So yeah.
Thank you. So I know our parents and guardians that are tuning in really would love to hear from all of you, different areas that you feel have really been most impacted due to the pandemic. And so today we know that there really is no systematic data that details the pandemic's impact on students' social emotional development. And really the best is educators' subjective assessments and surveys, and those are our best sources of information. So I thought that you could each share with us, based on your observations of working with our students at Bennett, what area or areas do you feel have been most impacted with the pandemic these past few years? What are you seeing? What have you done to support this or have adjusted? And Yvonne, could you kick us off?
Sure. I think one of the things that I see is a lot of increased worry, right? There's a lot of worry about taking those small risks, right? We've talked about making mistakes, making errors, persevering, sticking with it, getting a little frustrated with some things when they don't turn out just right. I'm noticing an increased amount of just worry around taking those risks. And I also, just this conversation has prompted me to think about that self-awareness that Shay was just talking about so eloquently. I don't think we really know what that worry feels like in our body. So increasing that self-awareness is so important. What does that worry feel like for you, right? Is it in your tummy? Is it in your head? What does it feel like when it's just a little worry? What does it feel like when it's a lot? Some of the things that I think that we even talked about here tonight is normalizing those emotions, right? Everyone, Charlay, you kind of kicked us off with that, right? Like absolutely validating those experiences. And I think modeling and using ourselves and our mistakes and our emotions as models, right? We are humans, we are adults, we're learning and we're growing. And I think really kind of that knowing ourselves and knowing I made a mistake there, I'm going to try this again. And I think that's so important. And so those are some of the things that I know we've all been doing to kind of help with, some of that increased worry.
Thank you. How about Charlotte? What have you seen?
For us in the SK classroom, one of the major effects that we've seen is with their social emotional development, how that then in turns affects their executive functioning. So when there is no regulation within the body, when we don't have those foundations laid for how to communicate effectively with our peers, how to problem solve, all of those things play on each other. So without those foundational skills being laid, we cannot continue to add more onto their plates and expect that they're going to be successful to see those things through. So really, what we did this year is slow down. Okay, what exactly does this specific group, and then what exactly do individuals in our class need? So we went back to our classroom promises, but we realized just continuing to point them out and acknowledging that they're there wasn't enough. So we made a checklist. So now when they come into the classroom, they are responsible for making sure their bodies are ready to receive messages. They follow all the steps on their checklist, and they're ready for the rest of the day. So now they can tend to a schedule. But without being organized within your body, having all of the materials that you need to get through your day, your water bottle, do you have your backpack? Is there something that a book that you want to read during quiet time that you brought? Without being organized and being able to plan for that, it makes the rest of the day a lot harder when you need to tend to a whole schedule and get through the day. And we may still be stuck on what happened this morning before we came into class because we didn't complete our checklist and follow our steps to make sure we were prepared. So some of the ways that we see this come up in the classroom is, yes, their organizational skills, checking in with their bodies. Are they able to advocate for themselves? Even something as small as going to the restroom when they need to go to the restroom. We know that, especially in SK, it's developmentally appropriate for sometimes kids to be so excited or so wrapped up in emotions that they are maybe regretting in another area. But making sure that we continue to have conversations, have checklists set in place, maybe charts. You have to do 1, 2, and 3. You have to take a token off the board before you can move on to the next thing. So that can be tailored to each child. If that is for a body check-in, then we can create a chart that checks in on that. If you need a checklist, not just for the beginning of the day, but the end of the day, or even for literacy, something that could be special for a child is your checklist is writing your name. That could be a task that we are working on, that we are continuing to practice. So that could be a token. So just tailoring the experience to each child, learning their needs, but also getting them to see that it's important that they advocate because we have such a short window of time with them to prepare them for the next grade, but also wanting them to know that you have to show up every day and be a part of your learning too. And this is how. So advocating for what you need. Do you need more time? Do you need a quiet space to work in? Is this a little bit challenging for you and you need a little bit more language and support from your teachers because you don't really understand what the expectation for you is, and letting them know that that is okay. Slowing down has allowed us to do that, to do a lot more of that work and be intentional about it. And those things continue to show up in the class, whether it's shifting their focus through transitions, like, okay, we have to stop coloring right now because we have to get to art. So reminding them, we have reminders all over our classroom. Our schedule is on the board. If they have checklists that are individual for them, they know where to go get those things. So making sure that they are too responsible for their learning and experience and for the role that they play in their community, so we can continue to prepare them for not just school and their learning environment, but for life.
Thank you. And what about Kim and working with the intermediate and middle school students? What have you seen?
A lot of what I've seen has been navigating relationships, conflict resolution. Middle school, definitely, it looks a little bit, what's the word I'm looking for, Jen? Like bigger, because they have other influences like social media and things like that. And I think that coming back into school, and I think sometimes we forget that school is a social setting as well. We always think about, oh, we have to do these things, but it's really like super social. And so now our kiddos are trying to relearn one another. Aside from them just developmentally starting to navigate relationships in a different way. So it's kind of like they're regressing back to who they were a year or two ago, but they have these like bigger kid expectations now of how they relate to one another, and getting them to a point where they can kind of slow down and stop. And I really love what Caitlin is doing with the sandpaper and the pom-poms, because that's one of the things I've seen with intermediate and middle school. They are rough with their words and rough with their bodies. And it's really because they're just trying to relearn how to be in this space together and know that over time we've changed as just people. So like how Shay was talking about morals, values, likes, dislikes, those things have also evolved during the pandemic. And so those things that they might have had in common with a friend prior to might not be the same anymore. And for our younger kids, they're trying to figure out why. And for our bigger kids, instead of saying, oh, okay, not my people anymore, it's a lot of feedback. And they've become a little bit more, with our middle schoolers, bolder. I think they've had a little bit more exposure, like with screen time. And so you see them mimicking, some of the things that they've been able to see on YouTube and whatever else that they're involved in, and bringing those things into their relationships with one another as a point to relate to one another. Because that is a commonality with the bigger kids. Like they have screen time and they can hang out on the weekends and things like that. So you're finding that their outside lives are coming more so inside of school, but then how do we navigate the two? Like, how am I a student and how am I a friend all at the same time? So that has been like the main thing that I've seen. And of course, like I said before, conflict resolution. It's like, okay, now we've gotten to this point. Instead of just being mad at one another, how do we resolve this without shutting down? Because from being at home for some time, you could just go to your room, or you could just close your laptop, or, you can easily separate yourself. And then now we're at school, we're together all day. And a lot of our kiddos have known each other for a really, really long time. So then those expectations of, we've been together since SK, but now they're in 5th grade and it's not the same, and trying to like navigate those ebbs and flows. So like a lot of the teachers, it's a lot of one-on-one conversations. When kids are not feeling good in their bodies, especially in the intermediate grades, working with Yvonne, we pull out our charts and it's like, point out how you're feeling, and then beginning to unpack those. One thing I can say is the level of reflection. I would even say like between 2nd and 7th, they all have the ability to reflect after the fact. So there's that impulsivity in the moment. And then it's like, oh, I shouldn't have done that. But then sometimes being so stubborn that they're not going to be the first ones to say, I was wrong, or, something like that. And so managing those expectations in the relationships.
I think even you commented on being at home, and I even think about even just being in the small bubbles, the small cohorts that we were in when we were in school, and just speaking of that space and how the social interactions have shifted even from the time that we were in person too. How about Jen? Do you want to go next and maybe expand not intermediate middle, but what you've seen with middle school and upper school students?
Sure. I know that I could talk about a lot of things for a long time, but I first just want to say, like, just hearing everyone speak, like, we have such strong teachers, and all the skills that you all were talking about. I'm like, it really is just building on all of those things, and it changes a little bit as they get older, but it really is like a lot of that self-awareness, and it just becomes a little bit more nuanced. So even like Kim was saying, like, we're trying to teach, fifth, sixth, seventh, ninth, 10th, and 11th graders, like, you can be really angry at a friend and still care for them at the exact same time. And like those two truths are there and they're real. And then like talking about like, okay, but now what do you do with that when you have those big emotions? And I do think what Kim was talking about too is how important that navigating and having autonomy when you are in that fifth, sixth, and seventh grade, and how you really want to do things on your own, but you need still boundaries and support doing that. Your peers are becoming so important. I actually really, one of the things that I've really kind of observed is that I really think that middle school age group, I don't want to like struggle the most during the pandemic, but struggled pretty intensely because they're at an age where they couldn't just say to their parents, I'm going to go ride my bike to my friend's house and hang out with them outside. Like they just weren't at that age yet, where some of the upper school students were able to, like they were able to take the train downtown and walk around downtown or walk around by the lake, even during like, pretty high exposure times because they were outside, and they had a little bit more autonomy, where the middle school students, they were kind of at home. And if they did not have siblings that they really got along with, which that's hard to come by at that age, they were kind of with themselves. And to speak to what Kim spoke of in your electronics, and right, like we know all the research and we want to limit screen time. And then the pandemic happened and we're like, here's a laptop, you're going to be on it all day long. And how difficult that was for students. And even, I mean, I can't tell you how many conversations I had about like, is it being supportive to tell students they can turn their screens off, or do they need their screens on because we need to see them engaged? And again, having those two realities like are truths, right? Like it's a lot to look at yourself all day long, especially in middle school and in high school. And at the same time, I know myself, when I turn my screen off, I'm not as engaged, right? So being able to kind of acknowledge and empathize with them. But just to say that, I know we've talked about kind of like the mental health of, I think that our country is actually, if anything good came out of the pandemic, recognizing how important taking care of mental health is for our young people, for ourselves as well, but also for young people. And they haven't been able to do so many studies because we're still actually in the pandemic, but they have been able to do some, and they're talking about how the rate of loneliness has actually really increased, and like recognizing how like we think about how connected we can be, like we can speak to all of you right now, and at the same time we all know that doing a Zoom call with your friends is not the same thing as being next to each other. And I always say that if you go onto public transportation, you go into, there's this one article that I really like that said like, I would get to class early and there'd be 20 people in the classroom and every single person would be head down on their phone. You can be with people and feel disconnected. And I think that that's what the pandemic has kind of created for some of our students. And so I have conversations with some of our students to be like, when you walk in and you put your laptop up right away, like that's communicating to people I'm not available, right? So what if you didn't do that? What would that feel like? And it feels really uncomfortable for some students. One of the things I'm actually really proud of, and I'm sorry if there are people out there, especially I'm sure none of my students are watching this, but just in case they're listening from the other room, I actually think it's so good that we collect phones at the beginning of the day. And there is research to back it. So I just want to say this, but I just want to say that, the research says like they have access to these devices all the time. What we can do as a school is give them a space where they do not get these notifications constantly, where they're not constantly checking social media for different conversations, different likes, different reactions, or anything like that. And it really just lets them to kind of be present to who they are with and to hopefully have more connections. But we know that even before the pandemic, technology was an issue, and loneliness and feelings of depression and anxiety were an issue. And so we know that like these are things are just going to continue. Like I said, I know that we are like time sensitive, so I want to be, but I have just been going into the 7th grade advisory classrooms, as well as I just finished with the 9th grade, and it was on healthy relationships. And I have seen that just really be challenging to navigate because there just aren't a lot of boundaries right now, especially with technology. And I asked both groups at times being like, do you think technology helps or is it harmful to building healthy relationships? And both groups gave me the answer of like, yes and yes. Like they're helpful, they can connect us, and they can also be like really hurtful and really harmful. And I think that like I said, kind of holding both those truths to recognize that we really need to take care of each other and to know boundaries. I've been talking a lot about consent. I say like consent is just asking someone like, what are your boundaries and how can I respect them? And that's a lot of different ways. Whether I always said, I was like, it started, I think, me talking about this a lot more, even just with masks. Like, are you comfortable with me not wearing my mask? How do you feel about this? To let people know where you're at. But it can go of being like whether the type of language you're using, or even any kind of like physical like boundaries that you're putting forth yourself. I've had these conversations when we went mask optional with people. How are you feeling about this? I'm not feeling very good. Talk to me about that. Tell me how you're, what goes through your mind. So all of these things, I've really seen students just kind of, I don't want to say like, yes, struggling, but almost kind of stumbling through it, and I love the idea of like really like helping and supporting students through those mistakes. Today I had a conversation with a student that I said, you know what, I have this meditation I do, and it's, like inhale, I do my best, exhale, I leave the rest, and just like, and they're like, I need to take that, Miss Newberry. I'm like, yes, you take that too. But just recognizing like, we are doing our best. This is all new territory. And I think that as students continue kind of like stumbling their way through it, Bennett has such a great supportive community, as like we have heard through like all the grades. And it's so like, I'm so grateful for all of you because it really does, it helps build those skills. So I could talk more, but I also want to be respectful. So, but again, thank you to everyone. And yeah, I'll pass it off to Jackie.
Yeah. I think one thing to kind of follow, I'm going to pass it right back to you, Jen. You mentioned studies coming from the pandemic around revealing widespread impacts on students' mental health. And we know, and you kind of touched on some of the things that you're seeing firsthand. Yeah. We know that there is a perceived stigma around mental health, which can be a barrier to access for support. So how has Bennett addressed this with our children and families? Maybe can you kind of extend that?
Absolutely. So there's 2 things that I did with different levels. So from 6th through 11th grade, or not having 8th, but like 6th, 7th, 9th, 10th, and 11th, we did do a suicide and depression screening at the beginning, or like towards the beginning of the year, which I know is kind of scary to hear those words said out loud, but it really is a screener to educate students. And I love this program. It's called Signs of Suicide. It's an evidence-based program. But what it really does is it actually teaches students how to identify when their friend might be struggling, when like, oh, I'm starting to hear my kind of self-talk this way and to identify safe adults to come and talk to. And through that program, it was so wonderful, but we did have a strong amount of students who asked for follow-up support. And then through that, we were able to actually get support for students who just wanted to kind of meet, with me occasionally. We started social groups. We students, we did scavenger hunts, like social emotional scavenger hunts around the school. We made glitter jars to help kind of like be able to help them to self-regulate a little bit more. That was more in 5th and 6th grade. And then with the upper school students, one of the things that I'm actually like so proud of the students, and that I have a handful of students, I want to say a small handful, but a handful of students who on a weekly basis actually sign up to use my office to meet with their own outside therapists in my office virtually. And what I think it does is it really normalizes as being like, these students I know, they're super smart, they're super successful, they have lots of friends, and these are people who get help outside of school. We don't make this public, but it's one of those things where I'll be kind of like doing some work in the Nook, and someone's like, "Oh, you're out here." I'm like, "Oh yeah, well my office is being used." And it's just one of those things where students know that they're able to sign up for that. And it's usually during like a lunch period, or it's during an elective. But it is something that I really think promotes that, if you're receiving support, it is because you're a person who recognizes that that sometimes we need a little bit extra help to make sure that we're taking care of ourselves to be healthy. And that's something that I really try to encourage with all of our students, that mental health is similar to physical health, and sometimes we need a little extra support, and then sometimes we don't need it, and then we kind of exit from that. So those are two things. One of the other things I do want to just quickly say is with the 5th, 6th, and 7th grade, we did a needs assessment at the beginning of the year. And I kind of wrote down like some of like the higher areas where people ask, but skills for resolving conflict, to go back to what Kim said, feeling stressed, help me feel better about myself and gain confidence, dealing with anger. And so I think that those are things that just students are just recognizing, like, hey, I'd actually like to improve on this. And then the last thing, I'm actually going to be starting a group with the 7th graders who are a little bit kind of like, I don't know if all the 7th graders want to make glitter jars, like I know the 5th graders do, because I had one student who missed that group and she still keeps on messaging me, being like, not messaging, just keeping me in the hallway saying, I haven't made my glitter jar yet. But 7th graders are a little bit trickier, but they identified having like a book club. And going back to even those stories that Caitlin, you were talking about, like that's a great way to be able to talk to students about different kind of issues, is using a book club to be able to. And lucky for me and lucky for them, I'm really into YA fantasy. So it is like, it's a good mix for us. But those are things that I feel like we're trying to do this to support them, because we know that mental health is so important and that they have been impacted by this pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Shay, could you just add on a little bit around the kind of perceived stigma around mental health and being a barrier of access to support from maybe more intermediate or primary grades?
Yeah, I think, I think it's that piece of using yourself as an example. I share my personal struggles with the kids all the time. And I think normalizing those conversations, like anxiety, depression, all of those things are actually brought up regularly. And we do, these check-ins where the kids will say, like, at our school, the connection sign is this. And if we are reading a book, I often borrow some from Yvonne of like a book all about depression or a book all about anxiety. I think all of those things, like, again, make kids not feel so alone and not feel shame. And I think that's the biggest thing of, if there's one thing that I've learned, is to use your own struggles to help others. And I think in our community, it is nothing, it's not pushed under the rug. Those types of things we encourage them being discussed, because I think the hardest thing and the stigma with mental health in general is you look fine and people don't see what you're feeling. Sometimes I always say to kids, sometimes I'd rather have a broken arm than have anxiety, because you could see it and people might feel for you or might be a little bit more understanding. And so I think that piece of checking in and having those discussions and normalizing it is a regular part of every day. And I've seen a lot of kids build relationships with other kids, being like, we'll do, hey, how are you feeling right now? Does this make you anxious? Like, give me a thumbs up if it does a lot, like maybe middle if it doesn't. And when you're doing that more regularly, it's not like kids are feeling like they're on the spot, and that's okay. And so I think, again, like, you're never too young to have those discussions about mental health. I mean, I have those discussions with my 4-year-old. Like, those things are like, if there's anything in this world that I personally feel passionate about, it's to change that stigma, because this is a huge part of the world. And you add on, this was already an issue. Anxiety, depression, all of those things have already been an issue for years that weren't talked about. And you add on this other layer of a pandemic, and people who might have been like, no, I don't struggle with this. It's a situational anxiety and depression, and everybody deals with it in some way or another. And what can we do to help each other get through those times? And I think another thing that I always like to point out is, like, what works for you might not work for somebody else. So, I'm not like, for me personally, deep breathing isn't always the best with depression and anxiety. It doesn't always calm me down. And so helping kids figure out what it is, and there's that, like, self-awareness piece and regulation piece brought into that as well, of what you need to help yourself feel better, to be able to handle everyday life. And I think the last thing I just want to say that I feel has been really powerful with the pandemic and mental health is on just calling it what it is. There is no, like, sparkle words around it, as much as I don't know what the better way to say it, but just calling it is what it is. Like, it is really hard to be a kid right now. It is, like, mentally, like, you are being taken away from everything that brings you joy. Like, that is going to affect you mentally. And so, that goes back to, like, of talking about, like, how it's affected kids. But I think also the last thing is when I communicate with families, I think sometimes, it's different generations and what they've grown up with, and how, we've been taught to talk about some of these things. I think even me bringing those things up to families allows them to feel more open, or all of you out there to feel more open to discuss those things, because it's nothing to be ashamed of. And I will always put that in the forefront of all that I do.
Thank you. I know that we are a little over time. I would like to end with one last question around coming together and creating a stronger sense of belonging for our students in our community. And so students and families, schools and communities are all part of broader systems. There are inequities based on race, ethnicity, class, language, gender identity, sexual orientation, ability, and other factors. And they're deeply ingrained in the vast majority of these systems. And they impact our students and our adults, social and emotionally, and then also for our students or academic learning. So while social emotional learning, or SEL, alone will not solve longstanding and deep-seating inequities in our education system, but it can create conditions needed for students, for children, and adults in schools to really examine and interrupt inequitable policies and practices. So can you describe for us, Yvonne, how emphasis on social emotional learning can create a stronger sense of belonging for all of our students? And what does that look like at Bennett?
So I know we're a little bit over in time, but I'll make it as short as possible. But I love this question because so many reasons. I love engaging in DEI work, and let me start with saying that it's hard. It's uncomfortable. It's something that we're not always going to get right. And there's a little bit of vulnerability and risk to it, but it's so incredibly worth that work. We have to persevere through it. We have to continue to engage in it. And there's lucky enough to work with a lot of wonderful professionals that are brave. And I've learned so much from those brave professionals. And so I think it's absolutely right to say that SEL is not the end all be all, and it won't solve all the different things that we have, all the systems, all the deep ingrained inequities. But I think what SEL does kind of allow that it's important to have that as part of the formula, so to speak, is that we learn that courage, that empathy, we learn how to connect with others, we learn how to celebrate differences. I think we learn how to be upstanders. We were talking about this today. We learn how to be allies, right? What does it look like to be an ally? And I think that's incredibly important to kind of build that foundation. And again, it's all about providing those opportunities to be able to engage in that work. So I'll leave that there. I had a few examples, but I'll leave that there.
Thank you. So first, I want to thank everyone on the panel for joining me this evening and joining our parent community and sharing all of your insights. I learn from each and every one of you every time I get to sit here and listen. And if I wasn't watching the clock, I probably would have kept you on a lot longer as well. So thank you so much. And thank you to all of our parents and guardians who joined us this evening, who are tuning in, that we can't see you, but as we work to support each and every one of our students together collaboratively. So have a wonderful evening, everyone, and thank you so much.